Trajan was the greatest conqueror Rome ever produced. But from the year 87 to the year 106, a barbarian king in the frozen mist of the Șureanului mountains forced him to do something Rome almost never did: sign a humiliating peace treaty and march back home. It took 2 bloody wars, a 100-foot marble column, and a lone cavalry officer hunting a king down to a cliffside to finish what a single wooden and stone wall started. This is the story of Sarmizegetusa Regia. His name was Decebalus. He ruled the kingdom of Dacia, and when the Emperor Trajan, the man later Romans would call the best of all their emperors, marched north across the Danube to break him, Decebalus did something almost no enemy of Rome ever managed. He beat them once. He forced them to a treaty. And then he made them come back and do the whole thing over again, because the fortress guarding his capital was built to make a Roman siege a nightmare. So how did a kingdom of mountain tribes at the very edge of the map hold off the full weight of the Roman army twice from behind the walls of a city called Sarmizegetusa Regia? To understand how this mountain kingdom did the impossible, we have to look beyond the legionary line, into the engineering of a wall that could flex, the arrogance of an empire pushed to its limit, and the bloody cat-and-mouse game that ended with a single horseman on a cliffside. And it all begins with the ground itself. This isn't a myth passed down through centuries of gossip. We know how this war was fought because Rome carved the evidence into stone. Stand in Rome today, and you can still look up at Trajan's column, a 100-foot spiral of carved marble, detailing everything from pontoon bridges and tree felling to soldiers bandaging their wounded in the mountain mist. Combine that marble propaganda with the physical archaeology unearthed in the Carpathians, and we aren't guessing. We are reading a military campaign, shot by shot. Start with the ground, because the ground is the whole story. Sarmizegetusa Regia was the Dacian royal capital, and it is important not to confuse it with the later Roman city, Sarmizegetusa Olpia, which the Romans built after the conquest at a different site, some 40 kilometers away down in the more open country. The royal one, the Dacian one, sat high in the Șureanului mountains, at an elevation of roughly 1,200 meters, protected by a system of hill forts and fortifications that the archaeological record dates across a long span. From roughly the 1st century before the Common Era down to the year 106 when it fell. This was not a single wall around a single city, it was a network. A ring of strongholds sitting on the ridgelines and the passes, each one covering the approaches to the next, so that an army trying to reach the capital had to climb, and fight, and climb again, exposed on narrow mountain tracks the entire way. Consider what that meant physically. The main fortifications at Sarmizegetusa Regia were built in a technique the Romans themselves came to call mirus Daciacus, the Dacian wall. 2 parallel faces of dressed stone blocks with a rubble and earth fill packed between them, tied together by transverse wooden beams set into carved notches in the stone. That construction gave the wall something a solid stone rampart could not offer. It flexed. A battering ram or an artillery stone that would crack a rigid wall was absorbed by a wall that could give a little and settle back. The blocks were large, cut and fitted without mortar, some of them weighing hundreds of kilograms, and the circuit walls ran several meters thick. A Dacian warrior on that ground did not need to be equal to a Roman legionary man for man. He needed the mountain to do the work, and the mountain did, and the network around the capital was deliberately layered. Bladaru anchored it, built with an interior keep, a fortress within a fortress, its towers positioned so that attackers who breached one line found themselves in a killing ground overlooked from a second. Koschei guarded the approach below it, a royal residence turned strong point watching the road into the heart of the kingdom. Around them, further forts like Piatra Roi, Șureanului, and Benunia, each watched a valley, a spur or a pass an army would have to use, completing the outer shell. These were not passive walls waiting to be knocked down. They were arranged so that the loss of one strengthened the defense of the next, funneling any advance into ground the defenders had already prepared. To reach the sacred and royal heart of the kingdom, The terraces, the sanctuaries with their rows of stone and wooden pillars, the great circular sanctuary that some have read as a calendar in stone. A Roman column had to peel back that shell one fortress at a time. In single file where the tracks narrowed with the high ground always belonging to the men above them. Now understand what that meant for the invader. Rome's army was the finest siege machine the ancient world had built. On open ground in a straightforward assault, it was nearly unbeatable. A legion could throw up a marching camp in an afternoon, dig a ditch and palisade around itself every night, build ramps and towers and torsion artillery, and grind down a city in weeks. But the Dacian fortress system was designed, whether by intention or by hard experience, to take away everything Rome was good at. There was no open ground to deploy on. There was no single gate to batter. There was a chain of positions, each of which had to be reduced in turn, in terrain where supply was brutal and the weather could end a campaign on its own. Every siege engine had to be either carried up the slopes or built from timber cut on the spot. Every wagon of grain had to be hauled along tracks that a handful of defenders could block. And the campaigning season in those mountains is short, closing in autumn and reopening late in spring. An army that failed to take its objective before the snows was an army that had to withdraw, resupply, and start again, which is exactly the kind of delay that turns one war into two. This is the reason the conquest of Dacia was not one war, but two. The mountain made sure of it. The man Rome sent to break that mountain was Trajan, Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, a Spaniard by birth from Italica in the province of Hispania Baetica, the first emperor to come from outside Italy, a soldier who had spent his life with the legions before he ever wore the purple. He is remembered as one of the great soldier emperors, the emperor whom the Senate afterward would salute with the formula that every new emperor be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan, Felicior Augusto, Melior Traiano. The scholarship that examines this period, including work on Trajan as the last great Roman conqueror, treats the Dacian Wars as the crowning military achievement of his reign. He did not treat Decebalus as a border nuisance. He committed serious force. To move an army north, he first built one of the engineering marvels of the ancient world, a permanent stone and timber bridge across the Danube, designed by his architect Apollodorus of Damascus, more than a kilometer long, resting on great masonry piers set into the riverbed. A bridge whose whole purpose was to say that Rome intended to cross this frontier and stay. The study of Roman legions in the East, from the reign of Augustus through to Trajan, shows an empire that could concentrate enormous professional strength and move it where it was needed, and Trajan brought that concentration to bear on the Danube frontier. Modern estimates put the force he assembled across the two wars at somewhere between 9 and 13 legions drawn from across the empire, together with auxiliary cohorts, and the highest modern estimates, which are themselves debated among historians, put the combined force, once the support troops are counted, at something that may have exceeded 100,000 men. That by itself tells you how seriously Rome took the wall in the Șureanului mountains. You do not move armies of that scale to punish a minor king. You move them because the minor king has already proven he can hurt you. And Decebalus had proven exactly that. Before Trajan ever came north, Decebalus had already humbled Rome under the previous emperor, Domitian. In the years around 85 and 86, the Dacians had crossed the Danube, killed a Roman governor named Appius Sabinus, and then destroyed a Roman army led by the Praetorian prefect Cornelius Fuscus, capturing its standards and its siege equipment. Domitian had ended that conflict with a settlement that many Romans regarded as shameful, a peace in which Rome effectively paid Decebalus subsidies and sent him engineers and craftsmen, the very kind of technical men who could help a mountain kingdom build better walls and better war machines. So when Trajan looked north, he was not looking at an unknown quantity. He was looking at a king who had already broken a Roman army in the field, and who had spent the years since being supplied, in part, by Rome's own money and Rome's own skilled hands. That is the background against which the first of Trajan's Dacian wars runs, across the years 101 and 102. Trajan crossed the Danube and pushed toward the heart of the Dacian kingdom, toward the fortress network guarding the capital. He fought a hard engagement at a place the sources call Tapae, in the past known as the Iron Gates of Transylvania, one of the gateways into the mountain country, and even a Roman victory there did not open the road. What he found beyond it was the terrain doing precisely what it was built to do, turning a march into a grind. Trajan's column shows the answer to that grind. Not one climactic assault, but roads cut into hillsides, forts thrown up at every stage, forests cleared, rivers bridged, the army advancing as much with the axe and the spade as with the sword. The fighting was hard enough, and the mountain resistance stubborn enough, that the first war did not end in the storming of Sarmizegetusa Regia. It ended in a treaty. Decebalus was forced to terms in the year 102. He remained king. His kingdom survived, but he accepted conditions imposed by Rome, the kind of terms a defeated but unbroken enemy is made to swallow. He was required to surrender his war machines and the engineers who had built them, to give up Roman deserters, to demolish his fortifications, to withdraw from the territories he had taken, and to accept the status of a client, a king who ruled only on Rome's sufferance and by Rome's leave. Hold on to that word, unbroken, because this is the hinge of the entire story, and it is where most people misread what happened. The first war did not destroy Decebalus. It humiliated him and it bound him, but it left him alive on his mountain behind his walls with his fortresses intact, or intact enough. Read the surrender terms again and you can hear the Roman anxiety in them. Hand over the engineers, tear down the walls, give back the deserters, surrender the artillery. Rome was not demanding those things at random. It was demanding precisely the things that had made the mountain dangerous, the technical knowledge, the fortifications, the trained men. And a treaty is only as strong as the will to enforce it. Rome had won a war and had not won the ground that mattered. The legions came back down out of the mountains, the client king stayed up in them. And a king who is still standing behind the wall that stopped you the first time is a king who has learned exactly how much the wall is worth, and exactly how far Rome was willing to climb to take it. Decebalus did not keep the peace. He did almost the opposite of keeping it. He kept the deserters he had promised to return. He kept rebuilding the fortifications he had promised to raise. He kept the engineers rather than surrendering them, and he went further. He began to draw the neighboring peoples, the tribes beyond his own borders, into a coalition against Rome, and by some accounts he even reached toward Rome's great rival in the east, the Parthians, looking for any hand that might be turned against the empire. The scholarship on Trajan's Second Dacian War is clear about the trigger, the Second War. Across the years 105 and 106 came because Decebalus broke the terms he had accepted. He had signed a treaty he did not intend to honor. He used the years of peace the way a besieged commander uses a truce, to rebuild, to rearm, to prepare the mountain for the next assault. He even, according to the sources, attempted to have Trajan himself assassinated by sending deserters into Roman territory, and he seized a senior Roman officer, a former consul named Longinus, holding him hostage, a man who chose to poison himself rather than let his life become a lever against the emperor. Each of these acts was a nail in the treaty. And when he broke faith, he handed Trajan both a reason and a resolve. The first war had been about forcing terms. The second war was about ending the problem permanently. This time, Rome was not coming to the Șureanului mountains to negotiate. It was coming to take the wall and everything behind it. This is where the war became one of the most punishing frontier campaigns Rome ever fought, and where the transformation of the Dacian world into a Roman one actually shows up in the ground. Trajan came back across his great bridge with the machinery of a permanent conquest, and this time the advance did not stop at a treaty. The legions worked their way up through the fortress belt, reducing the outer strongholds one by one, and then closed on Sarmizegetusa Regia itself. What the archaeology suggests happened there is telling. The defenders held, the Romans cut them off. And one of the decisive strokes was not a breach in the wall at all, but the severing of the water supply, the pipelines and cisterns that fed the mountain capital. A fortress that cannot be stormed can still be made unlivable. When the city finally fell, it was burned. The sanctuaries were thrown down, the great blocks toppled, and the site was systematically dismantled so that it could never again serve as the heart of a kingdom. There is scholarship tracing how Dacian hill forts along the frontier were made over into Roman forts, how the strongholds that had once defied the legions were absorbed, rebuilt, and turned into the bones of a Roman frontier. That is what conquest looked like here in physical terms. Not a single dramatic breach, but the methodical reduction of a fortified system, position by position, until the network that had made Dacia unconquerable was itself wearing a Roman uniform. The merest Dacicus that had flexed under Roman rams was pulled apart block by block. The passes that had funneled Roman columns into killing grounds were garrisoned by Roman auxiliaries. The very geography that had cost Rome a war became the shield that guarded the new province. The wall did not simply fall. It was digested. And in the Second War, the study of the Roman soldier against the Dacian warrior gives us a rare thing in ancient history, a name and a face attached to the end. His name was Tiberius Claudius Maximus. We know him not only from the scholarship, but from his own gravestone, a funerary monument discovered in Greece at Philippi, on which he had his career and his greatest deed carved for anyone to read, and even illustrated, with a scene of the moment that made his name. The scholarship on him, published in the study of Romanian intelligence history, calls him the captor of the Dacian king Decebalus, and describes him as one of the most decorated Roman officers of the entire campaign, a man who functioned as something close to a scout and intelligence officer, a cavalryman who had risen through the ranks, the kind of soldier who did not win the war in the front line of a siege, but who closed it out at the very end. His stone tells us he served first in a legion and then in the cavalry, that he was decorated by Trajan for bravery in the First War, and that in the second he was among the horsemen who ran down the fleeing king. Because the war did end with Decebalus, when his capital was gone and his fortress network was reduced and there was no wall left to stand behind. The last Dacian king did not surrender himself to a Roman triumph. He fled into the mountains with a handful of followers pursued by Roman cavalry, and when the riders closed in and there was no escape left, Decebalus, who had ruled from the year 87, chose the death of a king rather than the chains of a captive. He drew his own curved blade, the falx, across his own throat. He died in the year 106 at the close of the war he had reignited. And it was Maximus, the officer whose deeds were significant enough to be recorded and rewarded, who reached him at that final moment, whose own monument shows the mounted Roman bearing down on the kneeling king in the instant before the end, and who carried the king's severed head back to Trajan as proof that the war was over. The head was displayed to the army and then, by the accounts, sent to Rome. The scene on Maximus's tombstone is one of the very few images we have where a named ordinary Roman soldier and a named barbarian king meet in the same frame, at the exact hinge of history where a kingdom ends and a province begins. So, let me pull the threads together, because the way Sarmizegetusa fell rewrites the lesson people usually take from it. The wall in the Șureanului mountains was not beaten in a single glorious storm. It stopped Rome in the First War outright, forced the best emperor Rome would ever have to accept a treaty instead of a triumph, to take demolished fortifications and surrendered engineers as his prize instead of the burning capital he had marched for. It only fell in the Second War, and only because its own king broke the peace and gave Rome the reason to come back and finish what the mountain had denied them the first time. The terrain won the First War. It beat, by the estimates historians reconstruct from the campaign, somewhere between 9 and 13 legions, the largest concentration of force Trajan ever assembled, and sent them back down the passes with a treaty instead of a capital. The treaty lost the second one. Decebalus was undone not by the failure of his fortress, but by the decision to test Rome's patience twice, to treat a client king's oath as a delaying tactic against an empire that, once provoked a second time, would spend whatever it took to make sure there was no third war to fight. And that is the paradox worth sitting with. Sarmizegetusa Regia was one of the very few walls that genuinely beat the Roman army, that made Trajan, the last great conqueror, fight 2 wars for a prize he expected to take in one. Think of what that conquest cost and what it bought. The spoils were staggering. The Dacian gold and silver mines of the Apennines fell into Roman hands, and ancient estimates of the treasure hauled out of Dacia, though surely exaggerated, run on the figures historians reconstruct from the campaign into hundreds of tons of precious metal, enough that Trajan could fund the vast building program in Rome, the Forum and the markets and the Column itself, out of the plunder of one mountain kingdom. And the province Rome carved out lasted. Dacia stayed Roman for over a century and a half, until the Emperor Aurelian withdrew the frontier in the 270s. The mark of it is still on the map, a Romance language spoken today in the Carpathians, in a country whose very name looks back to Rome, born from the province that Trajan cut out of the mountain that had cost him 2 wars. The Oxford scholarship on Decebalus places his death at the center of the question of how Dacia became a Roman province, and that is the right place to put it. As long as the king lived behind the wall, the province did not exist. The moment the wall was reduced and the king was gone, Dacia became Rome's, and the hill forts that had defied the empire became the frontier that defended it. The mountain kept its promise. The king did not keep his. And somewhere between the two, between a wall built to flex under a battering ram and a treaty that shattered at the first pressure, the most successful conqueror in Roman history spent 2 full wars learning how much a wall in the Șureanului range was worth. Decebalus chose a blade to his own throat over Roman chains. So which was he? A tragic national hero fighting for the survival of his people, or a reckless king whose pride destroyed his entire civilization? I have my own answer. I would rather hear yours in the comments.